The teaching man. The point of today's episode isn't to encourage you to quit your job and join a profession of underpaid workers in places known as schools. The point is that you are already a teacher, whether you like it or not. At home, in the community, in your social groups, your friend groups, your sporting groups, your workplaces, you are already a teacher, knowingly or unknowingly. If you're a father, an uncle, a grandparent, if you interact with people who are younger than you, less experienced than you, or are new to a particular field or interest or environment, then by default you are already a teacher. That being the case, what I would argue is you may as well become a good teacher. And so today's episode will cover several areas, including time, including the fluidity of teaching, including the idea of knowledge, including the idea of energy. And there is a fifth aspect to teaching that we'll come to at the end of the video. Now, each of these areas of teaching deserves some consideration and unpacking. Time. In order to be an effective teacher, you need to understand that it takes time to learn. As much as you might want the process to be fast-tracked, as much as you might demand that the person on the receiving end of your teaching would click quicker, it takes time. And so, on the one hand, you need to be patient. That seems quite obvious, but in practice, it's very difficult when you are in that position of knowing to not be impatient. The other aspect of time to consider here is that you need to be generous with your time. Teaching someone, whether it be in a school, on the sporting pitch, in a DIY project, any sort of area, please understand that it's your generosity with your time that is so important. Irrespective of whether this is paid time and it's part of your job description, or whether it's your free time, quote unquote, your weekend, your volunteering, and that generosity with your time cannot be underestimated. The other aspect of time to consider here is that the time you spend teaching is precious and is valued. I'm sure you could put an hourly monetary figure on this. In fact, some people do when they allow people to take on their services as tutors, or indeed paid teachers or lecturers, trainers. But the point here is that it's precious and valued time more so in situations where you aren't being officially paid. It's time with someone that you care about. It's time that is invaluable in many respects. Time to bond, time to connect, time to share. In a way that is not just fleeting or coincidental. In a way that has innumerous tangible and intangible benefits. So, teaching is precious and valued time. The last aspect of time to consider is that you need to be present, which is to say that giving someone your time to teach them, to supervise them, to coach them, to support them, isn't just about physically being present for 20 minutes or an hour however long you supposedly are there for, however long you feel like you might be giving up your time, however much you might be ascribing value to the time. The idea is that being present is an active process, so that time isn't just a quantity. It's paying attention to the person you're trying to teach. And it underestimates, usually, all that happens during that time. So 20 minutes with an apprentice, or an hour with a group of students, or 30 minutes with a sporting team. It's more than just quantity. It's quality time, and you need to be present for that. The second aspect of being a good teacher is to understand that the process is fluid. And that being an active process, there is a constant dance, a continual feedback loop, and that it is not just a one and done transaction, certainly not a one-way transaction either. And so, whether this is in a school or a workplace or a sporting domain, what does this look like? It means that as a teacher, you are observing and responding to the cues and the situation and the student before you. Not that it's prescriptive in checking in every 10 or 15 minutes, depending on the situation. It might be that your observation and response is mandated by the minute or by the second. It certainly isn't a set and forget or a didactic process. There may be scope for situations where rote learning and didactic teaching could be warranted. But quality teaching does involve a continual, fluid, dynamic process of observation and response. Now, this fluidity could be analogous to feedback loops in various systems, or indeed the human body, whereby what you observe leads to some sort of measured response. If you're trying to teach someone and things aren't working out, what this would not mean is to simply try to hammer home the same point ad infinitum. What this would not mean would be to try and communicate a message, an idea, a concept, a movement in the same way, again and again and again, because, and I'm sure Albert Einstein has been infamously attributed to this quote, doing the same thing and expecting a different result is the definition of insanity. And I would argue that as a teacher, it's not just the definition of insanity, it's that you might drive yourself insane. Now, the other aspect of the fluidity, the dynamic nature of teaching, the feedback loops, is that naturally you need to expect questions. And as the teacher, quite possibly the older person, the more experienced person in this situation, take these questions objectively. Relish these questions. They're certainly not an attack on your ego. And in good faith, these questions may well be a way to ensure that as a teacher, as the trainer, as the coach, as the mentor, as the supposedly more experienced person in this situation, that you actually know what you're talking about. So respond to those questions in kind, rather than shooting them down. Now, the third aspect of teaching to cover here is the idea of knowledge. And within this, I'm including wisdom. Now, it seems obvious, but part of the contract of teaching is that knowledge is imparted. Knowledge is imparted. Now, we've talked about how you've been so generous in giving up your time that you understand the fluidity of the teaching process. But conceivably, if you withhold the idea of imparting knowledge, you could end up in a situation whereby the person trying to learn is literally fending for themselves. Sometimes that might be a useful and instructive, quote-unquote, process, letting them figure things out. But it might not be the most efficient process, nor the default state of teaching philosophy that you would want to maintain for the majority of that time. So, how do you impart that knowledge? Well, you need to teach it explicitly. Which means that you need to know it yourself. And secondly, you need to package it in realistic chunks at a rate that is realistically digestible. In a way that your mentee, your student, your apprentice, your trainee could reasonably latch onto. So, imparting knowledge. It doesn't happen by chance. Now, part of this is the idea of wisdom, which in some ways is knowledge gained from experience, and in some respects it's about knowledge gained from making mistakes. And so when we are talking about explicit teaching and imparting knowledge, there is a fine balance with also imparting wisdom, so that those who come after you, or those coming up through the ranks, or those you're trying to teach, can learn from your experience and can learn from your mistakes, or the mistakes of everyone else that has come before you. So consider that in that moment of teaching, it isn't necessarily anyone that could just impart the knowledge, when that person who's trying to teach may not have had lived experience and suffered through mistakes to be able to teach wisdom from an authentic position. The fourth aspect of teaching that I'd like to cover today is the idea of energy. So you've given up your time. You're ready to be part of that fluid feedback loop. You are imparting knowledge and pearls of wisdom like there's no tomorrow. What on earth does energy have to do with the teaching process? Well, in medicine, psychiatry, and indeed psychology, there is the idea of transference. If, as a teacher, I'm calm, then you, as a student, can be also calm. If, as a teacher, I'm impatient and stressed, then you, as the apprentice, the student, the learner, may feel pressured and stressed. If, as the teacher, I'm feeling upbeat and happy, then you give possibility for your learners to take on some of that happiness and that upbeat mood. Now, whether those feelings and that mood as a teacher are genuine is another matter altogether. But the idea here with transference is that the mood, the feelings, the energy that you bring has an effect on your audience. In particular, if it's clear that you are passionate about what you're trying to teach, if it's clear that you're passionate perhaps about the process of teaching or coaching or training in itself, then that rubs off. That trickles down. That goes some way to having an impact on your learners. Now, if your learners are having a rough time themselves, perhaps they're sleep deprived, perhaps they're preoccupied with issues at home, perhaps they're hungry and tired, then the phenomenon of countertransference can also occur. That you, as a teacher, may feel irritated, frustrated, annoyed, tired, And so being able to bring productive, positive, passionate energy to that teaching space in the first place is absolutely important. But not letting that energy being corrupted or disrupted by any counterproductive or negative energy and feelings from your learners is equally important. And the other aspect of energy to consider here is that the teaching process is effortful. It takes effort. It takes as much effort as you want, but it's certainly limiting if you are only inputting very little effort. Sure, if you are micromanaging, literally looking over someone's shoulder, then that effort becomes a little excessive, and the returns on that effort become diminishing. And it no longer becomes a imparting of knowledge or a teaching process, because at that stage the student, the learner, is just a machine or a tool as opposed to a human being. But by and large, the idea that it takes effort, it takes energy to teach, means that as a teacher, you need to make sure that when you arrive into that teaching space, that your own cup, that your own fuel tank is decently full, or as full as it can be. And you need to pace yourself and refuel and recharge and look after yourself so that you can continue to teach, because the process takes energy and takes effort. And as far as I'm aware, there's no such thing as a free and limitless source of energy as opposed to a transfer of energy. So, we've talked about time, we've talked about fluidity, we've talked about knowledge, and we've talked about bringing and using the right energy. The last point I'd like to address today is about passive teaching. And perhaps this is especially important for men. When you don't think that you are using your time to teach, when you don't realize that you are part of a feedback process, when it doesn't appear that you are imparting knowledge, when it's not apparent that you are using any energy, it doesn't mean that teaching is not taking place. The best example I can give to illustrate this is the idea, and again this is quite pertinent for men, of role modeling. That, I would argue, is a passive teaching process. So the way that you behave, present yourself, interact, what you say, what you're involved in, people can learn from that, and it takes none of your time. It takes a feedback loop that you are not consciously part of, and you are imparting knowledge without knowing. And it certainly takes no energy on your part. And yet, people can learn. The reason why I feel that this is a worthy aspect to mention in teaching is because in a 24-hour period, in a week, in a month, in a year, in a lifetime, you can certainly spend a fair chunk of that time teaching. You can certainly impart knowledge, give people your energy, and be part of the teaching and learning feedback loop taking place in dozens, if not hundreds or thousands of trainees, students, learners, players. But do not underestimate the balance of that time when you're not actively teaching, and the ability to influence others, to lead by example, to impart knowledge by way of the observation of others, and to inspire others to learn. I'm sure we are all familiar with sayings such as "do as I say, not as I do." I'm sure we all know about people that don't quite practice what they preach. And this is apparent in settings as varied as medicine, with doctors trying to teach and instruct patients, or in sports settings with coaches holding their players to a different standard to themselves. And so whether you're aware of it or not, others certainly are, and could interpret that as hypocrisy or as integrity, authenticity, believability, and in doing so, learn. Not to say that teachers, doctors, coaches, trainers, employers, fathers, adults are perfect. Far from it. In fact, that fallibility is an important aspect of being a teacher. Because for all we have talked about today, perhaps fittingly it would be fair to say, in summation, that the best teachers never stop learning. A teaching man